Hi, folks. Nathan here with Family Protection Ministries. I'm here to talk a little bit about some legislation and what's going on this week here in the California State Legislature. We're going to talk about a few different types of bills that may impact the family and what that means for the family and what it means for the legislative session coming along as it is. As we get started, let's remember that all of these leaders that are busy at work here in Sacramento all need our prayers. And so as we watch through the legislation, as things begin to heat up here in Sacramento, let's remember to pray for them. Pray for our leaders, and don't forget to pray for both our state leaders as well as our local leaders and our national leaders. So let's get into it. Welcome to the Front Line with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the Front Line. So the California legislature is heating up this week. In one sense, it's a short week. In one sense, it's a long week. In one sense, it's a short week because we had President's Day on Monday, so there's one less day for the legislature to do their work. And yet it is a long week because Friday is the deadline to introduce legislation. So hundreds of bills are pouring in right now, even over thousands. We'll be dealing with many, many bills over this next few days. So please be praying for us as we do that. So let's get into these bills now. A couple of these I've mentioned before. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on some of them. But let's go ahead and start with kindergarten. AB 1631, mandatory kindergarten bill, is a sort of carbon copy of a bill that we've worked with for a number of years. It's got the same language that has been in this a similar version of this bill for the last several years, and it's, I guess you could say, better language than it's been for the last 35, 40 years that we've been dealing with this particular issue and similar pieces of legislation dealing with mandating kindergarten or another year of education. So generally, we do not support the expansion of the state's authority over children's education or saying that you have to be in school for more years out of your life or something like that. Formalized education is something that the state imposes on children in California from ages 6 to 18. And that's known as compulsory education. And so 6 to 18 is the compulsory attendance age for attending school. There's a legal requirement in California to attend school. Kindergarten does not fall into that category. The age of 5 to 6 is not required. And in fact, there's actually no grade levels actually currently required in California state law. You're not required to attend first grade. You're not required to attend 12th grade. You are required to be in school during when you're age between ages 6 and 18, with some exceptions. We're not going to get into the exceptions today, but I just wanted to sort of give you the outline of the basic premise of the law regarding compulsory education law. It does not go down to age 5 or 4 or 3, which some other states do, but it does go from age 6 to 18. This bill that we're looking at now, AB 1631, requires that if you are going to enroll your child in a public school in first grade, you have to have them previously have completed a year of kindergarten. So it's not requiring 5-year-olds attend school. It is requiring that if you want to enroll your child in first grade in a public school, that child first has to complete a year of kindergarten. In other words, they have to show, when they enroll their child into first grade, a certificate of some kind that says that the child has completed a year of kindergarten. Now, I don't think that this is necessary. The public school teachers are convinced that it's necessary because primarily their number one argument here is that the students in first grade that have not completed a year of kindergarten are confused about how to line up and to be organized. And so it causes confusion in the classroom of first graders. So they think their perspective is that mandating a year of kindergarten prior to that will solve this confusion problem or a lack of being able to line up properly. And so that is why they're saying that they want to require a year of kindergarten prior to attending first grade in a public school. So this would apply to public schools. It specifically says public, and so it would apply to all public schools, first grade classes, whether that's a traditional public school, a charter school, public school independent study program, and it would apply to charter schools whether it's in person or whether it's a classroom-based charter school or a non-classroom-based charter school or a home-based charter school program. So, but for private schools, it doesn't apply to private schools at all, whether it's a campus-based private school or a home-based private school. None of those private school options are impacted by this bill at all. It does not affect them whatsoever. So, it's not a bill that directly impacts private homeschooling. However, it does have impacts on parental rights. And if this is something that's of concern to you, I would encourage you to make your voice heard on AB 1631. You can write your legislator or call them and ask them to oppose AB 1631 to let them know that you don't appreciate the government stepping in and requiring a kindergarten in the state of California. So let's move on to AB 1628. AB 1628 is a bill that modifies an existing law that has to do with the safe surrender of a child or an infant. And typically this is something that was established a few years back, where a person that has an infant that they determine they cannot care for within the first 72 hours of that child's birth, a person can leave that person, safely surrender them to a place like a hospital or a fire department, police station, and say, I can't care for this child, please take this child. And it's called safe surrender because that person does not have to answer any questions about the child. The person won't get in trouble for surrendering the child. They just surrender the child, and they know that the child will be taken care of in some way by the state. It's a state program where they wanted to make it so that people could safely surrender an infant without repercussions. And this was initially to attempt to keep people from leaving infants out and having them be just left to die somewhere. And so the state decided to open up this option for safe surrender so that those with infants that they couldn't care for could leave them somewhere knowing that they would be safe. So this bill, AB 1628, is an expansion of the safe surrender bill. It expands it from the 72 hours or 3 days, 3 days old infant to 30 days. So it gives a person a longer period of time to surrender an infant. But it also addresses another area of law, and that has to do with sex ed in schools and how this and other child care options would be discussed in the context of sex education in schools. So it's a little bit early to say exactly how this will impact in the long run. So we're going to be watching this bill to keep an eye on how that's going to play out, how that wording is going to develop over the next few months with regard to the sex ed portion of the bill. So that's definitely something that we are watching. That's AB 1628. Let's talk a little bit about AB 1884. This is a drug testing for students, and it has to do specifically with students that are athletic students, and talking about drug testing for athletic students to make sure that there's not cheating going on with regard to athletics. And so we're looking at this bill, and it's again early on in the legislative process, so there's expected to be some amendments here. But we're watching for how could this bill dealing with drug testing for minors, how could this be either amended or broadened at some point to include people beyond those in athletics? How could this bill be used to do various other types of testing on minors without regard to parents' consent or knowledge, things like that? So we're watching AB 1884 to keep an eye out for things that would impact parental role, the role of parents in their children's medical care, in whatever testing would develop along the way for in this bill and related code sections. So that's AB 1884. Let's see. There's a bill, AB 1914, Child Care Planning Mandates, that has to do with when you're developing the design of a community, that you would consider the mindset of having an eye out for not just schools in your planning, your community planning, but also childcare, planning out areas specifically for childcare facilities. And this bill we'll be watching just because it's a bill that kind of helped me think a little bit more about childcare facilities and how the California State Department that manages childcare facilities and licenses them is actually social services. But it's a very broad agency that oversees a number of different programs. And in fact, the California Department of Social Services oversees programs that over 8 million people are participating in. Over 8 million people in California, that's almost 25% of the people in California. We have almost 40 million people in California, so 8 million is almost 25% of that. That are participating in some program or other of the California Department of Social Services. So when you look at the state of California and how we rely on social services and what their focus is of caring for children and supporting families, it's interesting that much of a portion of our state is participating in or relying on these programs of social services. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it makes sense that the state would want to say, well, let's make sure that we're taking into consideration how we're planning out communities and making sure that there's childcare facilities in different locations as these communities develop. I find it a little bit disturbing how much of our state is reliant on government programs like various childcare services that are provided by the state. But be that as it may, that's part of the planning for this in this bill, AB 1914. That's what that bill is doing, is making sure that throughout the state of California, as communities develop, that there's a mindset of watching for where the state puts their childcare services facilities, or where they're going to make sure that there's a space for state-supported childcare services, that are licensed by the state. So, that's kind of an interesting thing to be considering about how much of the population of California is reliant on some of these programs. Next, let's look at AB 1598. AB 1598, with pastoral counseling and other counseling, it has it sets up some boundaries. And again, this one's a little bit early to say specifically how it could impact things. But in California, we have people that are specifically licensed to counsel people, to evaluate them, to diagnose them with a mental health disease, and to treat a mental health illness. Then you have other people that are counselors or people that do counseling, whether they get paid to do counseling or whether they do it on a volunteer basis. Many pastors do counseling, and there's a number of ministries throughout the state that are nonprofit organizations that do counseling, that provide counseling for free. Well, they're under a separate law, but this bill, AB 1598, addresses kind of both of these groups and talks about things that pastors or those that do counseling but that do not have the authority to diagnose or treat mental illnesses under California law. How it kind of shows that there's two different categories here and limits those categories. And in one sense, there's some flexibility within the pastoral counseling world under the law in California, but it's something that I'm definitely watching because of how in the past we have dealt with bills that were very restrictive on what pastoral counseling could include, and so we're concerned about that coming back. So we're definitely watching AB 1598. All right. Finally, I just want to talk briefly about SCR 116, which is the school choice resolution. It's stating that the last week of January is school choice week, recognizing that school choice is an idea that we should all be supporting, and that's something that I've talked about before. I'll link to an article about school choice week down below, but I think that there's some points in here in the school choice resolution that are positive towards families and recognizing that families should have a right to make decisions for their children, and that parents should be in the driver's seat when it comes to education. However, when it comes to the government's role in education and determining what options ought to be available to parents, I think there gets to be a sort of tension there when you look at parents having to choose from or select from the options that the government has enumerated. In other words, the government sets the boundaries from what parents are allowed to choose from. And that's not what we want to do. And so this school choice resolution makes me a little nervous because of some of that kind of thinking. It doesn't go out and say that the government's going to restrict the number of options out there, but some of the thinking in terms of how school choice is defined, it defines it in terms of what choices are there for school that the government will pay for, because those are considered by many to be the only option. And I think that's short-sighted because it's not the only option when you take responsibility for the things that you've been given responsibility for. You have the flexibility to do those things the way you think is best. When you don't take responsibility for it, in other words, you take funding from someone else, you are sort of getting them to help you, in which case you're also leaning on them for not just the support, but the boundaries in which you must operate to fulfill the obligation to receive those funds. So there's definitely some concerns about just the thinking behind that idea of how school choice gets defined. And we need to be remembering that parents have been put into the seat of responsibility when it comes to our children and our children's education, our children's upbringing, our children's health care. Even feeding our children is the responsibility of parents. It's not the responsibility of the state. We talked earlier about the wide number, the large number or huge percentage of California that relies on one of the social services programs that the state of California offers. Over 8 million people. And yet, this is not a biblical outworking of God's design for government. It is an expansion, or it's a overreach from the biblical jurisdiction of what God designed government to do, and it's reaching out into the arenas of family and church, which God designed to handle certain areas. The church was told to care for those that were in need, and so the family is responsible for taking care of their own. And it's really important that we remember that those jurisdictions exist from a biblical perspective when we look at government and what government programs are being promoted and how broadly those programs are being used, because it's sort of painting a picture for how our society is morphing and changing and moving towards more dependence on government, which is not good. It's taking less responsibility, and that leads to less freedom ultimately. So remember that with great abilities to have the freedom that we have, the freedom that we have allows us to take and keep the responsibility that God has given us. But that responsibility is growing the more that we become a narrower and narrower group of people that are actually taking that responsibility, exercising our responsibility, and fulfilling our obligations from a biblical perspective to fulfill the role of the family in society. It can become harder and harder for us, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It's always possible to do what God's called us to do, and that is to live out our responsibilities, our obligations in the jurisdictions that God has placed us in. And so as families, we need to fulfill the role that God's given us as parents, as children, as families, and in our communities. We also need to recognize that the church has obligations, has a role to play in our society as well. And we can just look to Scripture to see how those all fit together. And the more that we embrace our responsibility, I think the more opportunity we will find to serve in our communities in the context of where God has placed us and in the jurisdiction that God has placed us. So that's it for today, and thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.